Hello hockey fans, Oddman Rush here and welcome back to another video. In our last draft retrospective, we explored the 1996 NHL Entry Draft and highlighted how it was one of the craziest drafts the league has ever seen. Now since we typically look at drafts that were predominantly good or bad, it's time to go back to basics once again and explore a draft that most teams wish they could forget. And what better draft to choose than 1986? After all, thanks to the various prospects who completely missed the mark, and thanks to the numerous picks who failed to reach even the lowest of expectations, the 1986 draft has a special place in the league's history books for all the wrong reasons. So in today's video, join me as we explore why the 1986 NHL Entry Draft was an absolute mess. Now in order to understand just how awful this draft class was, let's take a look at all of the first round picks that failed to reach their potential in the many years that followed. And to do that, let's start with the latest selection of the round and work our way to the very top of the draft order. Strap yourselves in folks, it's gonna be a bumpy ride. Kicking things off, we have the 21st overall pick by the Edmonton Oilers, Kim Issel. The first of many regrettable picks from this draft class, Kim Issel would play just 4 NHL games, all with the Oilers during the 88-89 season, going scoreless and registering 0 penalty minutes during that span. Not the most exciting NHL career, but at least he made it to the show, right guys? Right guys? Following his brief tenure in the show, the Canadian-Austrian forward would spend the rest of that year, as well as the following 2 seasons down in the minors, before taking his talents overseas in 1991. From there, Issel would spend the next 7 seasons playing for various different teams in various leagues across Europe, produced solid scoring numbers everywhere he went, and won numerous trophies along the way, including championships in Austria, Italy and Slovenia. While playing a handful of games in the NHL isn't what any team wants from their first round draft pick, Issel still produced a solid career in the sport, so things could have turned out worse for him all things considered. It's just a shame that his success didn't come with the Edmonton Oilers, right? Next up, we have the 19th pick by the Washington Capitals, Jeff Greenlaw. A silver medalist with Team Canada at the 1985 World Juniors, Jeff Greenlaw would play parts of 5 seasons in the NHL, split between the Capitals and the Florida Panthers, notching 3 goals and 9 points in 57 games in the process. After a 4-game stint with the Panthers during the 93-94 season, the Canadian forward would embark on a long and successful career down in the minors. After spending half a decade with Florida's minor league team, the Cincinnati Cyclones, and after scoring 119 points in 283 AHL games, Greenlaw would join the Austin Ice Bats of the WPHL for the 98-99 season. From there, the forward would spend the next 5 seasons with the Ice Bats, join the team following their move to the CHL, and score 151 points in 252 games with the franchise, before hanging up his skates and retiring from the sport in 2003. Now sure, Greenlaw clearly didn't pan out and he never became a regular fixture in the NHL, but he did produce a 17-year pro career and he spent much of his time playing for minor league affiliates of NHL franchises. At least he was contributing to the organization's success in some way. Moving on, we have the 18th overall pick by the Quebec Nordiques, Ken McRae. One of the more experienced NHLers of this underwhelming group, Ken McRae would suit up in 137 NHL games over parts of 7 seasons split between the Nordiques and the Toronto Maple Leafs, where he notched 14 goals and 35 points during that span. Oh, and he also registered 350 penalty minutes while he was at it too, so he clearly wasn't afraid to drop the gloves either. Following a 9-game stint with the Leafs during the 93-94 season, the Canadian forward would spend the rest of that year, as well as the following 4 seasons, playing for various different minor league teams across North America, before retiring from the sport in 1998 after a lone year with the IHL's Houston Aeros. Despite calling it a day at just 30 years old, McRae would take his talents behind the bench and begin a career in coaching, as he spent the next 4 seasons serving as an assistant coach for a pair of minor league teams. After earning his first head coaching gig in 2002, McRae would spend the next 8 seasons serving as the bench boss for various different North American teams and take another assistant coaching gig before leaving the sport in a professional capacity following the 11-12 season. So not only is he one of the better players from this terrible bunch, McRae produced an 11-year pro career and spent 13 seasons as a coach too. Well, he certainly could have done worse, couldn't he? Now we have the 16th pick by the Calgary Flames, George Pelawa. The most tragic selection of this draft class, George Pelawa would never make it to the show, as he wouldn't play a single NHL game during his career. Unfortunately though, this outcome was due to him being taken before his time, as Pelawa was killed in an automobile accident just 3 months after the draft on August 30th, 1986. Pelawa was just 18 years old at the time of the accident. Now, I went back and forth on whether or not I should put Pelawa on this list, as he was never given the opportunity to prove whether or not he would live up to expectations, since both his career and his life were tragically cut short. However, given that I had never heard of Pelawa before researching this video, and given that many of you guys likely haven't heard his name either, I figured I would use this entry as an opportunity to highlight a talented young hockey player who was taken from us far too soon. I mean, the kid set a new scoring record for Bemidji High School, and he was named the top high school player in the state of Minnesota in 1986. There's absolutely no doubt that Pelawa would have had a long and successful career ahead of him had he not been killed in this tragic accident. On to the 15th overall pick by the Montreal Canadiens, Mark Pederson. Owner of the longest NHL career from this group, Mark Pederson would spend parts of 5 seasons in the league, split between 4 different teams, scoring 35 goals and 95 points in 169 games for his efforts. After playing a pair of games with the Detroit Red Wings during the 93-94 NHL season, the Canadian forward would spend the rest of that year, as well as the following 94-95 season down in the minors, before moving to Europe in 1995, where he played for 3 different teams in 3 different countries over the next 2 years. Having spent the following half a decade in Germany's DEL and having potted 178 points in 229 games, Pederson would return to North America and spend 3 years with the San Diego Gulls before retiring from the sport in 2005. Having hung up his skates for the final time, Pederson would embark on a long and successful career in coaching, as he spent the next 4 seasons as an assistant of the Bakersfield Condors, before spending the next decade and a half working as a head coach for a number of teams across the sport, including the Serbian national team, the Nikko Ice Bucks in Japan, as well as a 7-year tenure with Esbjerg Energy of the Danish Metalligaen. In fact, Pederson shall be returning to Denmark for the upcoming 23-24 season, as he has recently been hired as the new head coach of the Rungsted Sea Capitals, so he will get the chance to put his wealth of experience to good use once again. He may not have worked out long-term in the NHL, but spending 17 years as a pro hockey player and a further 18 years as a coach sounds like one hell of a career to me, folks. Next, we have the 14th pick by the Chicago Blackhawks, Everett Sanipass. The last of the decent entries from this group, Everett Sanipass would play 164 NHL games over parts of 5 seasons split between the Blackhawks and the Quebec Nordiques, where he notched 25 goals and 59 points during that span. Following a 29-game stint with Quebec during the 1991 season, the Canadian forward would spend the following 2 seasons playing exclusively for the Nordiques AHL affiliate, the Halifax Citadels, failed to play a single game during the 93-94 season, and spend the following year with the East Hants Penguins, before calling it a day in 1995, after scoring 30 points in 21 regular season games. Despite retiring from the sport at only 27 years old, Sanipass would seemingly leave hockey for good, as he hasn't served in any official or professional capacity in the 3 decades since hanging up his skates. Well, at least he spent a decent chunk of his time in the show then before calling it quits. I mean, most of these entries would have killed for the NHL career that Sanipass had. Now is the 12th overall pick by the Minnesota North Stars, Warren Babe. Yet another Canadian forward who didn't quite pan out, Warren Babe would spend parts of 3 seasons in the league, all with the North Stars, as he scored 2 goals and 7 points in 21 NHL games for his efforts. After a lone game with Minnesota during the 1991 season, the former World Junior Gold medalist would spend the rest of that year with the IHL's Kalamazoo Wings and score 32 points in 49 games before retiring from the sport at just 23 years old. Now, in Babe's defence, the forward had suffered numerous concussions, both during his major junior days as well as his pro career, and he was sidelined for the entire 89-90 season due to the lingering effects of these ailments. So I don't really blame him for changing career path, given how heavily these concussions had impacted his still young pro career. I mean, the guy was still in his early 20s, and he had already suffered more concussions than most players ever receive over their entire careers. Your health and your well-being has to come first, pro athlete or not. Penultimately, we have the 7th overall pick by the Vancouver Canucks, Dan Woodley. One of the worst selections of this entire draft class, Dan Woodley would play only 5 NHL games, all with the Canucks during the 87-88 season, scoring 2 points and registering 17 penalty minutes in the process. Well, at least he made some impact on the score sheet, right guys? Following his brief tenure in the show, the American forward would spend the rest of the 87-88 season with the IHL's Flint Spirits and win the league's Rookie of the Year award thanks to his 66 points in 69 games, before embarking on a long and successful career in North America's minor leagues, as he spent the next 7 seasons playing for various different teams in various different leagues across the continent and put up pretty solid numbers while he was at it too. After retiring from the sport in 1995, following his 3rd season in the Colonial Hockey League, Woodley would take a 12-year hiatus from the sport before returning behind the bench, as he was named head coach of the Regis Jesuit High School for the 07-08 season, a private Catholic high school in Aurora, Colorado. In fact, Woodley would perform so well at this job that he would remain in the role for each of the next 13 years, and he won 3 championships with the side before finally leaving the program just a few years ago in 2021. Though he produced a decent playing career, and he found his place many years later in coaching, playing less than half a dozen games and scoring only a pair of points as the 7th pick of your draft class isn't great, is it? Sounds like a bust if you ask me, folks. And finally, last and most definitely least, we have the 3rd overall pick by the New Jersey Devils, Neil Brady. The most disappointing selection of this draft class by a pretty sizable margin. Neil Brady would play only 89 NHL games over parts of 5 seasons split between 3 different teams, scoring 9 goals and 31 points during that span. Less than 100 games and only 31 points from the 3rd overall pick of the draft simply isn't good enough, whichever way you look at it. After a 5-game stint with the Dallas Stars during the 93-94 season, the Canadian forward would spend the rest of that year, as well as the following 94-95 season, with the IHL's Kalamazoo Wings, before leaving the organisation behind and embarking on a lengthy tour across the IHL, as he would spend the next 6 seasons playing for 5 different teams in the league and put up decent numbers wherever he went. After splitting the 2001 season between the Chicago Wolves and the Utah Grizzlies, and after potting just 6 points in 50 games that year, Brady would hang up his skates and retire from the sport once the season came to an end. And though he hasn't returned to hockey in any professional capacity in the 2 decades since, his career could have gone worse, all things considered. That said, he was the 3rd highest selection of his draft class, and he only spent double-digit games in the show, so he clearly failed to meet expectations, and then some. Now, it's worth mentioning that we have only highlighted the picks that played less than 200 games over the course of their NHL careers, and we still ended up discussing 9 different players. In fact, of the 21 players taken in the first round of the 1986 draft, 6 of them played less than 100 games, 4 of them played less than 50 games, while 1 never played a single game in the show, although that lone player was the late George Pelawa, so he gets a pass. Given that nearly half of the entire first round failed to reach their potential for one reason or another, this first round kind of flopped, didn't it? That said, the first round did feature some pretty great picks too. For example, Kerry Huffman and Tom Fitzgerald were selected later in the first round, Craig Janney and Jocelyn Lemieux were solid mid-round picks, while Brian Leach and Vincent Damphousse were the best players taken in the top 10. However, only 10 of the 21 first-round picks would play more than 500 games in the show, while just 4 of them would reach 1,000 NHL games. So while the 1986 draft did feature some pretty legendary players, they were few and far between, especially compared to other drafts of that era. Now, while the first round left a lot to be desired, there were plenty of later round picks who carved out long and successful careers in the NHL. For example, Teppo Numminen and Adam Graves were 2 legends that were taken in the second round. Jyrki Lumme, Bob Corkum and Mark Janssens were some of the best players from the middle rounds, while Lyle Odelin and Murray Barron were some of the various diamonds from the later rounds too. In fact, of the 231 players that were taken between rounds 2 and 12, 18 of them played at least 500 NHL games, 7 of them played at least 700 NHL games, while 3 of them played over 1,000 NHL games. The first round may have sucked, but the later rounds tried to make up for it with some solid selections of their own. So based on our findings in this video, I think we can all agree that the 1986 NHL Entry Draft was an absolute mess. Sure, the event did have some great picks, and some of them turned out to be legends of the game, but given that nearly half of the first round produced minimal careers in the show, and given that most of them didn't come anywhere close to reaching their potential, this draft was a disappointment, and then some. I mean, there's no way that you can call this draft an overall success, Hall of Famers or not. There were plenty of great selections, and it certainly wasn't the worst draft ever held, but if one event can be described as a letdown, it's 1986. And on that note, I'm going to end today's video. That was why the 1986 NHL Entry Draft was an absolute mess. What do you guys think about this draft or the selections that were made? Do you agree with me that it was a mess, or do you think that it was better than what I gave it credit for? Also, is there another draft that you would like me to look at in a future video? Do let me know in the comments below, I would love to hear what you guys have to say. But thank you very much for watching, guys, I do hope you have enjoyed. Please feel free to like, subscribe, share, watch some of my other videos. Thank you very much for watching, and goodbye. A big thank you to Bexy93, Burned Retinas, Drew Fawcett, Houston NG, Raquel and Worthless Pieces for helping support this video via Patreon. If you too want to help support the channel a little bit further and get a shout out at the end of every future video, make sure you head over to patreon.com/oddmanrush and become a patron today.